The Puppet Master's Strings, a Miss Marple mystery. Narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome, dear listeners, to another captivating mystery from Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your guide through the shadows of crime and the brilliance of deduction. Tonight we follow the sharp mind of Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a most peculiar case involving marionettes, hidden secrets, and a death that proves sometimes the strings that bind us are more dangerous than we imagine. So settle in with your favorite evening beverage, dim the lights, and let us begin this tale of the Puppet Master's Strings. Chapter 1: Strings and Shadows. The autumn afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward the parish hall, her knitting bag tucked securely under one arm. The annual harvest festival was in full swing, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from the hall where Mr. Edmund Hartwell was preparing for his much-anticipated puppet show. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, adjusting her spectacles as she observed the scene before her. Mr. Hartwell, a thin man in his 60s with nimble fingers and sharp eyes, was arranging his marionettes on a small stage he had erected near the hall's front window. The puppets were exquisite creations, each one carved with remarkable detail and dressed in miniature costumes that spoke of hours of painstaking work. "Ah, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Dolly Bantry, approaching with her characteristic enthusiasm. "You simply must see Edmund's new marionette. It's the most remarkable likeness of the vicar, though perhaps a bit too accurate for comfort." Miss Marple smiled gently, her keen blue eyes taking in the puppet in question. Indeed, the wooden figure bore an uncanny resemblance to their beloved vicar, complete with his slightly protruding ears and habitual worried expression. But it was another puppet that caught her attention, a figure dressed as a village constable that seemed somehow familiar. "Mr. Hartwell has such talent," Miss Marple murmured, though she noticed something in the puppet master's demeanor that suggested agitation beneath his professional composure. His hands, usually so steady when manipulating his marionettes, trembled slightly as he adjusted the strings. "Miss Marple," called young Tommy Fletcher, one of the village children who had gathered to watch the preparations. "Mr. Hartwell says he's got a special surprise for today's show, something he's never shown anyone before." Mr. Hartwell's face flushed slightly at the boy's enthusiasm. "Now Tommy, don't go building expectations too high. It's just a little something I've been working on in my spare time." Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward a locked wooden chest that sat beside his puppet theater. The chest was ornate, obviously old, and secured with a peculiar lock that seemed far more substantial than what one might expect for storing puppet equipment. Dr. Haydock appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, his medical bag in hand, despite this being a social occasion. "Fascinating craft, puppetry," he observed. "The level of control required, the precision of movement. In many ways it's rather like surgery. One wrong move and the illusion is shattered." As if summoned by the doctor's words, Inspector Slack emerged from behind the puppet theater, his usually stern expression softened by what appeared to be genuine interest in Mr. Hartwell's work. "Remarkable detail in these figures," he said, examining a puppet dressed as a medieval knight. "Must take considerable time to create such pieces." Mr. Hartwell's response was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Cynthia Pemberton, the village's self-appointed cultural authority. Her sharp voice cut through the gentle murmur of conversation. "Edmund, I do hope this performance will be more suitable for children than your last effort. Some of the parents were quite concerned about the violent themes in your medieval puppet play." The puppet master's jaw tightened visibly. "Art shouldn't be sanitized for convenience, Cynthia. Children are more resilient than adults give them credit for. They understand the difference between performance and reality." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her tone brooking no argument, "this is a church function, and we must maintain appropriate standards." Miss Marple observed this exchange with interest, noting the way Mr. Hartwell's hands clenched and unclenched as he struggled to maintain his composure. There was clearly tension between the two, though she suspected it ran deeper than mere artistic differences. The arrival of Mr. James Whitmore, the village solicitor, created another ripple of tension. The elderly lawyer approached the puppet theater with obvious reluctance, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something that looked remarkably like apprehension. "Afternoon, Edmund," Mr. Whitmore said stiffly. I trust everything is in order for today's performance." The puppet master's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Oh yes, James, everything is exactly as it should be, perhaps more so than it has been in quite some time." Miss Marple's instincts, honed by decades of observing human nature, detected an undercurrent of meaning in this seemingly innocent exchange. Mr. Whitmore's discomfort was palpable, and she noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the locked chest beside the puppet theatre. As the afternoon wore on, and more villagers gathered for the show, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe not only the performance but also the reactions of the audience. There was something in the air today, a tension that had nothing to do with the usual excitement of a children's entertainment. The puppet theatre itself was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, its red velvet curtains and gilt trim speaking of a more elegant era. Mr. Hartwell moved behind it with practiced ease, his voice carrying clearly as he began his opening narration. "Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome to a tale of secrets and revelations, of hidden truths, and the strings that bind us all." As the curtain rose and the first marionettes appeared, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Hartwell's words carried more meaning than a simple introduction to a puppet show. The way certain members of the audience shifted uncomfortably suggested she wasn't alone in this perception. The performance that followed was indeed masterful, but Miss Marple found herself watching the puppet master as much as his creations, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor as the story unfolded. Whatever secret surprise he had promised, whatever lay hidden in that locked chest, she suspected it would prove far more significant than anyone in the audience could imagine. As the first act concluded, and Mr. Hartwell announced a brief intermission, Miss Marple made a mental note of who seemed most eager to leave, and who lingered near the puppet theatre. In her experience, the most innocent-seeming situations often concealed the darkest secrets, and something about this autumn afternoon in St. Mary Mead felt anything but innocent. Chapter 2. The Locked Chest Secret. During the intermission, Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from the refreshment table, while maintaining her discreet observation of the puppet theatre area. Mr. Hartwell had stepped outside, apparently to take some air, leaving his precious marionettes unattended. This seemed unusual for a man who typically guarded his creations with zealous care. Miss Pemberton seized the opportunity to examine the puppets more closely, her critical eye assessing each detail. "Really," she muttered to Mrs. Bantry, "some of these figures are quite inappropriate for a church function. That one there looks suspiciously like our late Mayor Wickham, and not in a flattering light either." Miss Marple moved closer to observe the puppet in question. Indeed, the marionette bore a striking resemblance to the former mayor, who had died under rather scandalous circumstances involving municipal funds. The puppet was dressed in formal attire, but held tiny papers in its wooden hands, papers that upon closer inspection appeared to be miniature documents. "Artistic license, surely," Mrs. Bantry suggested, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Dr. Haydock joined their small group, his professional eye examining the craftsmanship. "Extraordinary detail," he murmured. "Look at the joints, the way the strings are attached. Mr. Hartwell must have studied anatomy to achieve such realistic movement." Inspector Slack, who had been examining the puppet theatre's construction, looked up from his inspection. "Built to last. This is fine woodwork. But that chest," he nodded toward the ornate box beside the theatre. "That's not puppet storage, that's a strong box if I ever saw one." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Mr. Whitmore, who had approached the chest and was standing remarkably close to it, his face pale and perspiration visible on his brow, despite the cool autumn air. When he noticed her observation, he quickly moved away, but not before she caught sight of something metallic glinting in his hand, a key perhaps. The return of Mr. Hartwell interrupted her speculation. The puppet master's demeanor had changed during his brief absence, where before he had seemed nervous, now he appeared almost grimly determined. He moved directly to the locked chest, and Miss Marple noticed that he produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, a key that looked remarkably similar to the one she thought she had seen in Mr. Whitmore's possession. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Hartwell announced, his voice carrying a new edge, "the second act of today's performance will feature something truly special, a puppet that has never been displayed publicly before." He unlocked the chest with deliberate ceremony, and Miss Marple observed the faces of those gathered around. Mrs. Pemberton looked intrigued but wary. Dr. Haydock appeared professionally curious. Inspector Slack seemed mildly interested, and Mr. Whitmore looked positively ill. From the chest, Mr. Hartwell withdrew a marionette that caused a collective gasp from the assembled audience. The puppet was exquisitely crafted, dressed in the robes of a judge, complete with a powdered wig, and holding a tiny gavel. But what made it remarkable and disturbing was its face. The wooden features had been carved with such skill that they perfectly captured the likeness of Judge Harrison Blackwood, the Crown Court judge who had presided over several high-profile cases in the region before his mysterious disappearance 3 years prior. The puppet's expression was stern and accusatory, its glass eyes seeming to stare directly at individuals in the audience. "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Bantry. "It's Judge Blackwood to the life." Mr. Whitmore had gone completely white and was gripping the back of a chair for support. Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath suggested she too recognized the significance of this particular puppet's appearance. Miss Marple noted these reactions with great interest, but it was Inspector Slack's response that proved most telling. The usually unflappable police officer was staring at the puppet with an expression of dawning recognition, and what might have been fear. "Where did you acquire the materials for such a detailed likeness, Dr. Haydock inquired, his medical training making him curious about the anatomical accuracy of the carving. Mr. Hartwell's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say I had excellent reference materials. Sometimes the most authentic art comes from direct observation." As he began to manipulate the Judge Blackwood puppet, making it walk across the small stage with disturbing realism, Mr. Hartwell's voice took on a different quality, deeper, more resonant, almost as if the puppet itself were speaking. "Justice," the puppet seemed to say through its master's ventriloquism, "is not always served in the courtroom. Sometimes it must be found in unexpected places, revealed through unexpected means." The puppet's wooden gavel struck the stage 3 times, each blow echoing through the suddenly silent parish hall. Miss Marple noticed that with each strike, Mr. Whitmore flinched as if physically struck himself. "The truth," the puppet continued, "has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. Secrets, like bodies, don't stay hidden forever." At these words, several members of the audience began to shift uncomfortably. Mrs. Pemberton's face had taken on a greyish pallor, and she appeared to be having difficulty breathing. Inspector Slack's hand had moved unconsciously toward his coat pocket, where Miss Marple suspected he kept his notebook. The puppet's performance continued with increasing intensity. Mr. Hartwell manipulated the strings with expert precision, making the judge puppet point accusingly at various members of the audience. Each gesture seemed deliberate, targeted, as if the puppet master knew something specific about each person it indicated. "Edmund," Mrs. Pemberton said sharply, her voice cutting through the performance, "I think that's quite enough for a children's show." But Mr. Hartwell appeared not to hear her, lost in his manipulation of the marionette. The Judge Blackwood puppet had produced a tiny scroll from its robes and was unfurling it with wooden fingers. "Evidence," the puppet declared, "preserved in the most unlikely places. Documents that were thought destroyed, testimonies that were thought silenced, witnesses who were thought eliminated." At the word eliminated, Mr. Whitmore made a choking sound and rushed from the hall, his face grey with terror. His sudden departure caused a stir among the remaining audience, but Mr. Hartwell continued his performance as if nothing had happened. Miss Marple filed away every detail of these reactions, her mind already working to piece together the connections between the puppet master, his extraordinary creation, and the obvious distress it was causing among certain members of the audience. The puppet show was clearly much more than entertainment. It was a revelation, an accusation, and quite possibly a very dangerous game that Mr. Hartwell was playing with forces he might not fully understand. As the Judge Blackwood puppet took its final bow, and Mr. Hartwell began to pack it carefully back into the locked chest, Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder what other secrets might be hidden in the puppet master's workshop, and whether his string pulling extended beyond wooden marionettes to the very real lives of the people around him. Chapter 3. Tangled in Deception. The evening following the puppet show found Miss Marple taking her customary walk through the village, her mind still occupied with the peculiar events at the parish hall. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to evening prayer, but the usual peaceful ambience of St. Mary Mead felt somehow disrupted. As she passed Miss Hartwell's cottage, a modest dwelling near the edge of the village, she noticed that the lights in his workshop were still burning brightly despite the late hour. Through the uncurtained window, she could see the puppet master bent over his workbench, his hands moving with practiced precision as he worked on what appeared to be another marionette. The cottage itself was unremarkable from the outside, a typical village dwelling with a neat garden and well-maintained exterior, but the workshop addition at the rear was clearly where Mr. Hartwell's true passion lay. Shelves lined the walls, filled with puppet heads in various stages of completion, spools of string, tiny costumes, and the tools of his trade. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Haydock, who was making his evening rounds, and had stopped to inquire about old Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism. "Quite a performance today," the doctor remarked, following Miss Marple's gaze toward the illuminated workshop. "Though I must say, some of the audience seemed rather more affected by it than one might expect from a simple puppet show." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "I couldn't help but notice Mr. Whitmore's reaction to that particular puppet. Most distressing for him." Dr. Haydock frowned. "James has been under considerable strain lately. I've been treating him for nervous exhaustion, though he's been rather secretive about the cause. Perhaps today's events were simply too much for his current state of mind." As they spoke, the door to Mr. Hartwell's cottage opened, and Mrs. Pemberton emerged, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled. She hurried past them without acknowledgement, her face set in grim lines, and her hands clutched tightly around a manila envelope. "Now that is interesting," murmured Dr. Haydock. "Cynthia Pemberton visiting Edmund Hartwell in the evening. Those two have barely spoken civilly to each other since that incident with the Christmas pageant last year." Miss Marple made a mental note of this observation. Miss Pemberton's visit to the puppet master, so soon after the disturbing puppet show, suggested that the Judge Blackwood marionette had prompted more than casual concern. Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who approached with his characteristic brisk efficiency. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock," he greeted them. "I don't suppose either of you has seen Mr. Whitmore this evening. His housekeeper is quite concerned. He returned home from the festival in a dreadful state and locked himself in his study. She could hear him moving about, opening and closing drawers, but he won't respond to her calls. Most unusual behavior for James," Dr. Haydock observed. "Perhaps I should look in on him professionally." "That might be wise," Inspector Slack agreed. "There's been talk in the village about some irregularities in property transfers that Mr. Whitmore handled recently. Nothing official yet, but enough whispers to make people nervous." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "What sort of irregularities, Inspector?" "Documents that don't quite match up, signatures that look questionable, that sort of thing. The sort of issues that might attract the attention of someone like Judge Blackwood, if he were still." Slack paused, seeming to realize the implications of his own words. The three stood in contemplative silence, each processing the potential connections between the mysterious Judge Puppet, Mr. Whitmore's distress, and the suggestion of legal improprieties. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from Mr. Hartwell's cottage. Through the window they could see the puppet master in animated conversation with someone partially hidden by the workshop's shadows. The stranger's voice was unfamiliar, with a harsh quality that carried clearly through the evening air. "You've gone too far this time, Edmund," the unknown voice declared. "This isn't a game anymore. People are going to start asking questions you can't answer." Mr. Hartwell's response was calmer but firm. "The truth has a way of demanding recognition. I'm simply providing a venue for that recognition." "Truth?" The stranger's laugh was bitter. "You wouldn't know truth if it strangled you with puppet strings. You're playing with forces beyond your understanding." Miss Marple moved closer to the cottage, using the shadow of a large oak tree to conceal her presence. Through the window, she could now see the stranger, a tall man with graying hair and a face marked by what appeared to be old scars. His clothing was expensive but rumpled, suggesting hasty travel. "Mr. Morrison," she whispered to herself, recognizing the man as a solicitor from the nearby town of Welchester. His presence in St. Mary Mead, particularly in Mr. Hartwell's workshop, added another layer of complexity to the mystery. Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack had also moved closer, their professional instincts alerting them to the potential significance of the heated conversation. "I have every right to display my work," Mr. Hartwell was saying.
Art is about revelation, about holding a mirror to society and showing what lies beneath the surface. Your art is going to get people killed, Morrison replied sharply. Do you understand what you're dealing with? These aren't simply village gossips or petty scandals. There are people who will go to extraordinary lengths to keep certain truths buried. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Mr. Hartwell reaching for something on his workbench, a puppet head that even in profile looked remarkably like Morrison himself. The solicitor's face went pale when he saw it. You wouldn't dare, Morrison breathed. Wouldn't I? Mr. Hartwell's voice carried a note of dangerous amusement. Every secret leaves traces, Morrison. Every crime creates evidence, and some of us are very good at preservation. The conversation that followed was conducted in lower tones, but Miss Marple could see Morrison producing a thick envelope from his coat pocket and placing it on the workbench. Mr. Hartwell examined its contents briefly before shaking his head and pushing it back toward the solicitor. Not enough, the puppet master said clearly. Not nearly enough to make this go away. Morrison's departure from the cottage was abrupt and angry. He strode past the three observers without noticing them, his face set in furious lines. As his footsteps faded into the distance, Miss Marple found herself wondering what sort of secrets could prompt such desperate negotiations. I think, she said quietly to her companions, that Mr. Hartwell's puppet show this afternoon was merely the opening act in a much larger drama. And I fear that before this particular performance concludes, we may discover that some strings once pulled can never be untangled. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. I'll be keeping a close eye on developments. Something tells me this village is about to become a good deal less peaceful. As they made their way back toward the village center, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the puppet master's strings were already pulling at forces that might prove beyond anyone's control to manage.
Chapter 4. The Workshop of Whispers. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple was in her garden tending to her late-blooming roses despite the weather when Mrs. Bantry arrived, with news that set her investigative instincts humming. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened," Mrs. Bantry announced, her umbrella dripping as she hurried up the garden path. Mr. Hartwell's workshop was broken into last night. Miss Marple straightened, her gardening forgotten. Indeed? Was anything taken? That's just it? Nobody knows? Mr. Hartwell is being most secretive about the whole affair. Inspector Slack spent the better part of the morning there, but Edmund won't say what, if anything, is missing. He just keeps muttering about insurance and backup plans. This information prompted Miss Marple to abandon her roses entirely. Within the hour, she found herself walking past Mr. Hartwell's cottage, ostensibly on an errand to the post office, but in reality hoping to observe the aftermath of the break-in. The cottage appeared normal from the street, but as she drew closer, Miss Marple could see that the workshop window had indeed been forced. The glass had been carefully removed rather than smashed, suggesting that the intruder had been more concerned with stealth than speed. Mr. Hartwell himself was visible through the damaged window, methodically examining his collection of puppet heads. His movements were deliberate and controlled, but Miss Marple's keen eye detected a tension in his posture that spoke of considerable stress. "Terrible business this," came a voice behind her. Miss Marple turned to find Dr. Haydock approaching, his medical bag in hand and his expression troubled. "Any injuries?" Miss Marple inquired. "None physical," the doctor replied. "But Edmund is clearly shaken. He's asked me to examine some of his more delicate puppets for damage. Seems particularly concerned about the ones stored in that locked chest." As if summoned by their conversation, Inspector Slack emerged from the cottage, his notebook in hand, and his expression grim. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock," he greeted them. "I don't suppose either of you noticed anything unusual last night. Someone moving about the village after dark, perhaps?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I did observe Mr. Morrison leaving the cottage quite late, and Mrs. Pemberton's earlier visit seemed rather urgent. Both departures struck me as somewhat agitated." Inspector Slack made a note. "Yes, we'll need to speak with both of them. This wasn't a random burglary. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for." Dr. Haydock frowned. "What makes you so certain?" "The way the workshop was searched," Slack explained. very methodical, very specific. They went straight for the storage areas where Edmund keeps his finished work. But here's the curious thing, they didn't touch the valuable tools or the gold leaf he uses for decorative work. This was about the puppets themselves. Miss Marple's mind began to work through the implications. Inspector, was the locked chest tampered with? That's what's so interesting, Slack replied. The chest was opened but with a key not forced. Edmund insists he has the only key, but the lock shows no signs of being picked. At this revelation Miss Marple recalled her observation of the previous afternoon, Mr. Whitmore appearing to hold a similar key, and his extreme distress during the puppet show. The possibility that duplicate keys existed opened troubling avenues of speculation. Their discussion was interrupted by the appearance of Mr. Hartwell himself, who emerged from his cottage with obvious reluctance. His usual neat appearance was dishevelled, and his hands bore small cuts that suggested he had been handling broken objects. "Inspector," he said, his voice strained, "I've completed my inventory. Nothing appears to be missing, but several items have been disturbed." "How?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Hartwell glanced at her with surprise, as if he hadn't noticed her presence. "Some of my puppets have been repositioned, examined carefully. Whoever did this was looking for something specific, something small enough to be hidden inside a puppet." Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "Hidden inside? You mean in the hollow spaces of the carved heads?" "Precisely, Mr. Hartwell confirmed. The construction of marionettes creates numerous small cavities where documents or other objects could be concealed. It's an old trick among puppet makers. We've been hiding things in our creations for centuries." Inspector Slack looked up sharply from his notes. "Are you saying that your puppets might contain hidden items? Documents perhaps?" Mr. Hartwell's expression became guarded. "I'm saying that the possibility exists. Whether any of my particular creations contain such items is another matter entirely." Miss Marple observed this careful phrasing with interest. The puppet master was clearly choosing his words with legal precision, suggesting that he was very much aware of the potential implications of his craft's concealment capabilities. "Mr. Hartwell," she said carefully, "yesterday's puppet show seemed to cause considerable distress among certain members of the audience. Might I ask where you acquired the materials to create such exact likenesses?" The puppet master's eyes hardened. "My sources are confidential, Miss Marple. An artist protects his inspirations, even when those inspirations might be evidence in a criminal matter." Inspector Slack interjected. "Especially then," Mr. Hartwell replied firmly. "Art has always been the enemy of those who prefer darkness to light, lies to truth." As if to punctuate his statement, the sound of an approaching automobile drew their attention to the road. A black car had pulled up near the cottage, and from it emerged a figure that caused a visible reaction among the assembled group. Mr. Whitmore, but not the nervous, pale man who had fled the puppet show. This version of the village solicitor appeared haggard and desperate, his clothing wrinkled as if he had slept in it. "Edmund," Whitmore called out, his voice carrying across the small garden. "We need to talk, privately, Mr." Hartwell's expression showed no surprise at this demand, but neither did it show any willingness to comply. "I think, James, that the time for private conversations has passed, don't you?" The tension between the two men was palpable, and Miss Marple noted that Inspector Slack had quietly positioned himself where he could intervene if necessary. Dr. Haydock, too, had moved closer, his medical instincts apparently alerting him to the potential for physical confrontation. "You don't understand what you're playing with," Whitmore said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't a village squabble or artistic expression. There are people involved who will not tolerate exposure." "Then perhaps," Mr. Hartwell replied with dangerous calm, "they should have thought of that before they chose to involve themselves in activities that required concealment." The conversation that followed would prove to be far more revealing than anyone present could have anticipated, and far more dangerous than even Miss Marple's experienced instincts could have predicted. Chapter 5, A Performance Most Final. The confrontation between Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Whitmore was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Pemberton, who approached the cottage with obvious determination despite the continuing drizzle. Her appearance only heightened the tension that had been building since the break-in's discovery. "Edmund," she called out, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "I need to speak with you immediately about last night's incident." Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Pemberton's usual imperious manner seemed strained, as if she were working to maintain control over emotions that threatened to overwhelm her composure. The cultural arbiter's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her handbag, and her eyes darted nervously between Mr. Hartwell and the damaged workshop window. "It seems," Inspector Slack observed dryly, "that Mr. Hartwell is quite popular today. Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside, where it might be more private." Mr. Hartwell hesitated, clearly reluctant to invite such a gathering into his personal space, but the alternative, a public confrontation on his doorstep, appeared even less appealing. With obvious reluctance, he gestured toward the cottage door. The interior of the cottage was as neat and precise as one might expect from a craftsman of Mr. Hartwell's caliber. The front room was modest but comfortable, with built-in bookcases lining the walls and a collection of smaller puppets displayed in glass cases. But it was the connecting door to the workshop that drew everyone's attention. It stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the puppet master's true domain. "Now then," Inspector Slack began, settling into a chair that gave him a clear view of all present, "perhaps we can sort out exactly what happened here last night." Mr. Whitmore had positioned himself near the window, his nervous energy making it impossible for him to sit still. "This is all unnecessary, Inspector. A simple break-in, probably local youths looking for something to steal, nothing more sinister than that." "Local youths," Mrs. Pemberton said sharply, "do not typically carry keys to private premises, James, nor do they conduct such methodical searches." The accusation in her voice was unmistakable, and Mr. Whitmore's face flushed. "Are you suggesting that I was involved in this break-in? That's preposterous." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the interplay between the three principals, decided to introduce a more direct approach. "Mr. Whitmore, yesterday you seemed to recognize the Judge Blackwood puppet with remarkable specificity. Might I ask about your acquaintance with the judge?" The question struck like a physical blow. Whitmore went pale and gripped the windowsill for support. Judge Blackwood presided over several cases in which I appeared as solicitor. Nothing unusual in that." "No," agreed Miss Marple gently, "except that the judge disappeared 3 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained. Yet Mr. Hartwell has created a puppet bearing not just his likeness but his exact expressions, his precise mannerisms. Such detail suggests very intimate observation." Mr. Hartwell, who had been arranging items on a side table with nervous precision, looked up sharply. "Art requires close study, Miss Marple. I am very thorough in my research." "Research," repeated Inspector Slack. "And where exactly did you conduct this research on a man who vanished without trace?" Before Mr. Hartwell could respond, Mrs. Pemberton spoke up with obvious agitation. "This is precisely why I tried to warn you, Edmund. Some subjects are too dangerous to explore, some truths too explosive to reveal." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining a collection of antique medical instruments displayed on the mantelpiece, turned toward the group. "I'm beginning to suspect that we're not discussing artistic inspiration here. Are we talking about actual contact with Judge Blackwood?" The silence that followed this question was profound and uncomfortable. Miss Marple noticed that both Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Pemberton were avoiding eye contact with Mr. Hartwell, while the puppet master himself seemed to be struggling with some internal decision. "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "might it be worth examining Mr. Hartwell's workshop more thoroughly? If someone was searching for something specific last night, perhaps we should determine what they were seeking." "Excellent suggestion," Slack replied, rising from his chair. "Mr. Hartwell, I'll need you to show me exactly what areas were disturbed." The procession into the workshop revealed a space that was both artistic studio and technical laboratory. Workbenches lined the walls covered with tools, paints, fabrics, and the various components needed to create lifelike marionettes. Shelves held puppet heads in various stages of completion, while strings and control mechanisms hung from carefully organized hooks.
but it was the area around the large lock chest that showed the most obvious signs of disturbance. Tools had been moved, drawers opened and incompletely closed, and the floor around the chest bore scuff marks suggesting that heavy objects had been shifted. They were definitely focused on this area, Inspector Slack observed. Mr. Hartwell, you mentioned that the chest was opened with a key. Are you absolutely certain you have the only key? Mr. Hartwell's hesitation was telling. I believed so, but clearly that belief was mistaken. Miss Marple moved closer to examine the chest itself. The lock was indeed substantial, far more complex than what would be needed for storing puppet equipment. This appears to be a document safe rather than a simple storage chest, most unusual for a puppet maker's workshop. Unless Dr. Haydock suggested, the puppets themselves aren't the only things being stored here. At this suggestion, Mr. Whitmore made a choking sound and moved toward the workshop door. I can't, this has gone too far. Edmund, you must stop this madness before someone gets seriously hurt. But Mr. Hartwell was no longer listening to protests or warnings. With deliberate ceremony he moved to the chest and withdrew his key. Perhaps it's time for a full revelation, he said, his voice carrying a note of finality that made everyone present straighten with attention. The chest opened to reveal not only the Judge Blackwood puppet from the previous day's performance, but several other marionettes that immediately drew gasps of recognition from the assembled group. Each puppet was a masterwork of craftsmanship, but more importantly, each represented a person connected to some aspect of village life or village secrets. There was a puppet bearing the unmistakable features of the late Mayor Wickham, complete with a miniature briefcase filled with tiny documents. Another represented a woman Miss Marple didn't immediately recognize, but whose elegant dress and imperious bearing suggested nobility or at least pretensions to it. A third puppet, dressed as a barrister, bore features that seemed familiar yet somehow distorted. Good heavens, breathed Mrs. Pemberton, staring at one particular puppet with obvious horror. That's Lady Ashworth, but she's been dead for 2 years. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Lady Ashworth had indeed died 2 years ago, allegedly in a riding accident on her estate near Welchester. The death had occasioned some talk in the region due to irregularities in her will and questions about the inheritance of her considerable property. Edmund, Mrs. Pemberton continued, her voice rising with panic, where did you get the materials to create such exact likenesses of these people? Mr. Hartwell's smile was enigmatic, and more than a little disturbing. Let's just say that death is not always the end of one's usefulness to society. Sometimes the departed can serve justice in ways they never could while living. Inspector Slack had moved closer to examine the puppets, his professional instincts clearly alarmed by what he was seeing. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to need you to explain exactly how you came by the detailed knowledge necessary to create these figures. Knowledge, Inspector, comes from many sources. Sometimes it's given freely, sometimes it must be discovered, and sometimes it's preserved in ways that ensure it can never be truly lost. Dr. Haydock had gone quite pale, his medical training apparently allowing him to read implications that others might miss. Edmund, are you suggesting that these puppets contain actual materials from the people they represent? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. If Dr. Haydock's suspicion was correct, then they were dealing with something far more serious than artistic eccentricity. Mr. Hartwell's response was interrupted by a sound from outside the cottage, the distinctive rumble of a heavy vehicle approaching at speed. Through the workshop window, they could see a black van pulling up to the cottage, followed closely by a police car that Miss Marple didn't recognize as belonging to the local constabulary. Expecting visitors, Inspector Slack asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket. Mr. Hartwell's expression had changed dramatically. Where before he had seemed confident, even defiant, now he appeared genuinely frightened. They're not my visitors, Inspector. And their arrival suggests that our conversation has become academic. The sound of car doors slamming was followed by heavy footsteps approaching the cottage. Through the windows, Miss Marple could see several men in dark clothing moving with the purposeful coordination of law enforcement officers, but not local ones. Hartwell, came a voice from outside, amplified by what sounded like a megaphone. This is Detective Chief Inspector Morrison of the Metropolitan Police. We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with an ongoing investigation. The name Morrison caused both Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Pemberton to react with obvious alarm, though Miss Marple noted that their reactions seemed to be directed more at the implications of official intervention than at surprise at the identity of the speaker. Metropolitan Police, Inspector Slack said sharply. What's a London detective doing in St. Mary Mead with a search warrant I know nothing about? Mr. Hartwell had begun moving with sudden urgency, reaching into the chest and withdrawing several small objects that he quickly concealed in his clothing. Inspector Slack, I'm going to tell you something that may be difficult to believe, but I ask that you remember it carefully. Judge Blackwood didn't disappear, he was murdered. And the evidence of that murder, along with evidence of several other crimes, has been preserved in ways that certain people find inconvenient. Before anyone could respond to this extraordinary statement, the cottage door was forced open with considerable violence, and Detective Chief Inspector Morrison entered with several constables. Morrison was indeed the same man Miss Marple had observed arguing with Mr. Hartwell the previous evening, but now he wore the authority of his official position like armor. Edmund Hartwell, Morrison announced formally. You are under arrest on suspicion of interfering with a criminal investigation and concealing evidence in a capital crime. As the constables moved to secure Mr. Hartwell, Miss Marple noticed that the puppet master managed to catch her eye and make a subtle gesture toward one particular puppet in the chest, the Judge Blackwood marionette. Something in his expression suggested that this particular creation held significance beyond its obvious craftsmanship. The arrest proceeded with official efficiency, but Miss Marple's attention was caught by the behavior of Mrs. Pemberton and Mr. Whitmore during the proceedings. Both appeared relieved rather than shocked, as if the Metropolitan Police intervention was a development they had been expecting, perhaps even hoping for. Hartwell was led away in handcuffs. He called back to the group still gathered in his workshop. Remember, the truth always surfaces eventually, and sometimes it does so in the most unexpected forms. Chapter 6, Hidden Strings and Metropolitan Secrets. The departure of Detective Chief Inspector Morrison and his team left an uncomfortable silence in the cottage workshop. Inspector Slack was clearly agitated by the Metropolitan Police's intervention in what he had considered a local matter, while Dr. Haydock appeared deeply troubled by the implications of Mr. Hartwell's final statement. Miss Marple, however, was most interested in the behavior of Mrs. Pemberton and Mr. Whitmore, both of whom seemed remarkably composed considering they had just witnessed the arrest of a fellow villager on serious charges. Well, Mrs. Pemberton said with what sounded like forced brightness, I suppose that's the end of this unpleasant business. Edmund always was too fond of sensationalism for his own good. Mr. Whitmore nodded eagerly. Quite right, Cynthia. Best to let the Metropolitan Police handle matters from here. No need for further village involvement. Inspector Slack turned sharply toward them. I'm not so sure about that. This arrest raises more questions than it answers, particularly about how the Metropolitan Police came to be involved in what appeared to be a simple break-in. Miss Marple moved closer to the puppet chest, which had been left open in the confusion of the arrest. The Judge Blackwood marionette was still there, along with the other disturbing figures Mr. Hartwell had created, but something about the arrangement struck her as different from what she had observed earlier. Inspector, she said quietly, might I suggest that we examine these puppets more carefully before the Metropolitan Police return to collect them as evidence? Dr. Haydock joined her at the chest, his medical training making him naturally curious about the construction details. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, he murmured, lifting the Judge Blackwood puppet carefully. But there's something odd about the weight distribution. This puppet is heavier than it should be. Under Dr. Haydock's expert examination, it became apparent that the puppet's hollow areas had been weighted with something more substantial than the sawdust typically used in marionette construction. A careful probe revealed that the puppet's torso contained a waterproof packet, skillfully concealed within the wooden framework. Good heavens, Inspector Slack breathed as Dr. Haydock carefully extracted the packet. Documents. The packet contained several items, photographs that appeared to have been taken secretly, what looked like legal documents bearing official seals, and a letter written in a hand that trembled with either fear or illness. Miss Marple examined the letter carefully. The handwriting was educated but shaky, and the content was extraordinary. If you are reading this, then my fears have been justified and I am likely dead. The conspiracy I discovered involves corruption at the highest levels of the judicial and legal system in this region. Evidence of case fixing, witness intimidation, and worse is contained within these documents. I had hoped to present this evidence to higher authorities, but I fear my position has been compromised. Hartwell has agreed to preserve this evidence in a form that my enemies would never think to search. Trust him, for he alone knows the full extent of what we discovered. The letter was signed, H. Blackwood, in the distinctive hand of the missing judge. Judge Blackwood gave these documents to Mr. Hartwell before his disappearance, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. This suggests that the judge suspected he was in danger and took steps to preserve evidence of whatever corruption he had uncovered. Mr. Whitmore had gone very pale during the reading of the letter, while Mrs. Pemberton appeared to be having difficulty breathing. Both were staring at the documents with expressions of undisguised fear. James, Mrs. Pemberton said urgently, we need to leave, now. Indeed you do, came a voice from the workshop doorway. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison had returned alone this time, and his expression was far from official, though I'm afraid it's rather too late for that. Inspector Slack stepped forward protectively. Chief Inspector, if you're here to collect evidence, I'll need to see your warrant again. Morrison's laugh was unpleasant. I'm not here in an official capacity, Inspector Slack. I'm here to clean up a mess that should have been dealt with 3 years ago. The implication was clear, and Miss Marple felt a chill of genuine danger. Morrison's earlier argument with Mr. Hartwell, his knowledge of the cottage's layout, his convenient arrival with an arrest warrant, all of it suggested a level of involvement that went far beyond proper police procedure. Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple said quietly, I wonder if you might examine the other puppets in that chest. I suspect we may find additional evidence that certain parties would prefer remained hidden. As the doctor began his examination, Morrison moved closer, his hand resting conspicuously on something concealed within his coat. I really must insist that you stop this investigation immediately, for your own safety of course. But Dr. Haydock had already made another discovery. The Lady Ashworth puppet contained a similar packet, this one containing what appeared to be a will that differed significantly from the document that had been probated after her death. Forgery, Inspector Slack said grimly. Comparing the dates and signatures, someone created a false will to redirect Lady Ashworth's inheritance, and someone killed Judge Blackwood to prevent him from exposing that forgery. Miss Marple added, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Mr. Morrison, I believe you were involved in both crimes. Morrison's facade of official authority crumbled entirely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, old woman. This conspiracy involves people far more powerful than a village detective and a meddling spinster. Mr. Whitmore suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking with strain. Morrison, this has gone far enough. I won't be party to violence against innocent people. You'll be party to whatever I decide. James, Morrison replied coldly. Unless you prefer to join Judge Blackwood in permanent silence. The threat was unmistakable, and Miss Marple realized that they were in considerably more danger than she had initially suspected. Morrison was clearly prepared to use violence to protect the conspiracy that Judge Blackwood had died trying to expose. Inspector Slack, she said calmly, I believe this would be an excellent time to radio for assistance from the county constabulary. But Morrison was already moving, his hand emerging from his coat with the metallic glint of a weapon. I'm afraid that won't be possible. This investigation ends here, permanently.
Chapter 7. When Puppets Dance with Death. The chaos in Mr. Hartwell's workshop began with the unexpected crash of the remaining window, as 2 figures burst through it simultaneously. The first was Mr. Hartwell himself, apparently having escaped from police custody with remarkable efficiency. The second was a man Miss Marple didn't recognize, elderly, distinguished, and bearing the unmistakable bearing of judicial authority. Judge Blackwood, gasped Mr. Whitmore, staring at the newcomer, as if seeing a ghost. Indeed, the man's appearance was so similar to the puppet marionette that the resemblance was uncanny. But this was clearly a living person, though one who showed signs of having lived under considerable strain. His hair was greyer than in the puppet's representation, his face bore new lines, and his clothing suggested someone who had been living in hiding, rather than in comfort. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison's weapon wavered between the multiple targets now facing him. Impossible, he breathed. You're dead. I made sure of it. Reports of my death, Judge Blackwood said with dry humor, have been greatly exaggerated, though your attempts to arrange my actual demise were certainly thorough enough. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly to process this extraordinary development. The judge's survival meant that the entire investigation had been based on false premises, but it also suggested that the conspiracy was even more extensive than she had realized. How? Morrison demanded, his composure cracking entirely. The car accident, the explosion, was carefully staged with the assistance of Mr. Hartwell here, the judge replied calmly. When I realized that my investigation had put me in mortal danger, I decided that disappearing was preferable to dying. Edmund provided both the means to fake my death and a secure location to continue my work. Mr. Hartwell had moved to stand beside the judge, and Miss Marple noticed that both men carried themselves with the confidence of people who had carefully planned for this confrontation. The puppet shows, she said with sudden understanding, were a way of testing the waters, weren't they? To see who would react with guilt to your apparent resurrection. Precisely, the judge confirmed. We needed to identify all the members of the conspiracy before taking action. The puppets were an ingenious way to gauge reactions without revealing my actual survival. Inspector Slack, who had been following this revelation with obvious bewilderment, stepped forward. Judge Blackwood, if you're alive, then we need to report this to the proper authorities immediately. The proper authorities, Morrison said with a bitter laugh, are exactly what we've been trying to avoid. This conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of regional law enforcement and the judiciary. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been silent during these revelations, suddenly spoke with desperate urgency. This is madness. Judge, you must understand, we were forced into cooperation. Morrison threatened our families, our livelihoods. We had no choice. Judge Blackwood's expression softened slightly. Cynthia, I understand the pressures you were under, but your cooperation still resulted in genuine injustices. Lady Ashworth's rightful heirs were defrauded, and several innocent people were convicted based on falsified evidence. Dr. Haydock had continued examining the puppets during this extraordinary conversation, and now he looked up with obvious alarm. Judge Blackwood, how many cases were affected by this conspiracy? The judge's expression grew grim. At least a dozen major cases over 3 years. Property frauds, false convictions, evidence tampering. The corruption was systematic and extensive. Morrison's weapon was now trained directly on Judge Blackwood. None of that matters now. You should have stayed dead, Harrison. It would have been much simpler for everyone. But before Morrison could act on his threat, the workshop was once again interrupted by new arrivals. This time, however, the newcomers were uniformed officers from what appeared to be a different force entirely, men wearing the insignia of Scotland Yard. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison, announced the lead officer, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Please drop your weapon immediately. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, rage, and finally resignation. How? He asked simply. Judge Blackwood smiled for the first time since his dramatic reappearance. Did you really think that a man with my experience in criminal justice would undertake such an operation without proper backup? Scotland Yard has been investigating this conspiracy for months with my full cooperation. As Morrison was taken into custody, the full scope of the operation became clear. Judge Blackwood's death had been an elaborate sting operation, designed to uncover the complete network of corruption that had infected the regional legal system. The puppets, Mr. Hartwell explained to the assembled group, served a dual purpose. They allowed us to preserve evidence in a form that would never be suspected, and they provided a means to test the reactions of suspected conspirators. Miss Marple nodded with appreciation for the scheme's elegance. And the break-in last night, we staged that as well, the judge admitted. We needed to create urgency, to force the conspirators into revealing themselves through desperate action. Mr. Whitmore, who had been silent during the arrests, finally spoke with obvious relief. Judge, I want you to know that I never participated willingly. Morrison had evidence of a minor indiscretion from years ago, and he used it to force my cooperation. I understand, James, the judge replied kindly. Your cooperation with our investigation will be taken into account." Mrs. Pemberton was weeping quietly, the strain of months of fear and guilt finally overwhelming her composure. "I never meant for any of this to happen. When Morrison first approached me about influencing cultural events to provide alibis for certain individuals, it seemed harmless enough." Inspector Slack shook his head in amazement. "So the entire puppet show yesterday was designed to flush out the conspirators." "Among other things," Judge Blackwood confirmed. "We needed to identify everyone involved before we could move against the conspiracy. Your presence, Inspector, along with that of Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock, provided the perfect cover for our operation." Miss Marple had been quietly observing the proceedings, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who had solved numerous mysteries. "Judge Blackwood, there's one element of this case that still puzzles me. How did you manage to obtain such detailed evidence of the conspiracy's activities?" The judge's expression grew serious. "That, Miss Marple, required the cooperation of someone with access to the conspiracy's inner workings, someone who was willing to risk everything to expose the truth." As if summoned by his words, another figure appeared in the workshop doorway, a woman Miss Marple recognized as Morrison's secretary from the Welchester Constabulary. Her presence explained how the judge had obtained such detailed inside information about the conspiracy's operations. "Mrs. Crawford," the judge said gratefully, "has been instrumental in gathering the evidence needed to expose this corruption. Her courage in coming forward made this entire operation possible." The secretary smiled nervously. "I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people being convicted while guilty ones went free. When Judge Blackwood approached me about helping to expose the truth, I knew I had to take the risk." With the arrest of Morrison and the exposure of the conspiracy, the workshop began to clear as official statements were taken and evidence was collected. But Miss Marple lingered, studying the marionettes that had played such a crucial role in bringing justice to light. "Quite an elaborate performance," she observed to Mr. Hartwell, who was carefully packing his precious creations. "Sometimes," the puppet master replied with a smile, "the truth requires a bit of theatrical presentation to be properly appreciated. I'm just grateful that our strings led to the right conclusion." As Miss Marple made her way home through the village streets, she reflected on the case's unique elements. It had been a mystery where the supposed victim had orchestrated his own investigation, where art had served justice, and where the manipulation of strings, both literal and metaphorical, had ultimately revealed rather than concealed the truth. Chapter 8: The Marionette's Final Bow. The following morning brought a clarity to St. Mary Mead that seemed to mirror the resolution of the conspiracy that had cast its shadow over the village. Miss Marple was in her sitting room, reviewing the morning papers, when Dr. Haydock arrived with additional details about the investigation's conclusion. "Quite remarkable how it all unfolded," the doctor said, settling into his usual chair with obvious satisfaction. "The Scotland Yard officers have been most thorough in explaining the operation to those of us who were unwittingly involved." Miss Marple set aside her newspaper, which featured a front-page story about the exposure of judicial corruption in the region. "I must confess, Doctor, that I found Judge Blackwood's approach both ingenious and rather theatrical. Using puppets to expose human duplicity has a certain poetic justice to it." Indeed, Dr. Haydock agreed, and the medical aspects of the case were fascinating. The judge's supposed death was remarkably well staged. Even I might have been convinced if I had been called to examine the scene. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who appeared considerably more relaxed than he had during the previous day's dramatic events. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock," he greeted them. "I thought you might like to know that we've received a full confession from Mrs. Pemberton and a comprehensive statement from Mr. Whitmore. The scope of this conspiracy was even broader than we initially realized." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "In what way, Inspector?" "The falsified evidence and case fixing extended beyond property fraud," Slack explained. "Several criminal cases were affected, with innocent people receiving harsher sentences, while co-conspirators received lighter treatment or avoided prosecution entirely." Dr. Haydock frowned. "How many innocent people were affected?" "Judge Blackwood's review suggests at least 15 cases over 3 years," Slack replied grimly. The appeals process is already beginning for those wrongfully convicted. The magnitude of the conspiracy's impact was sobering, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the courage it must have taken for Judge Blackwood to risk everything to expose such systematic corruption. "Inspector," she asked, "has there been any word about Mr. Hartwell's legal situation? His methods may have been unorthodox, but his intentions were clearly honorable." "The charges against him have been dropped," Slack confirmed. "In fact, he's being commended for his assistance in the investigation. His puppet-making skills proved invaluable in preserving evidence and creating the elaborate deception necessary to expose the conspiracy." As if summoned by their conversation, Mr. Hartwell himself appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate, carrying a small wrapped package. She invited him in, curious about his purpose in visiting. "Miss Marple," the puppet master said with obvious gratitude, "I wanted to thank you personally for your assistance yesterday. Your observations and questions helped expose details that might otherwise have remained hidden." He presented the wrapped package with a slight bow. "I've created something for you, a small token of appreciation for your role in bringing justice to light." Miss Marple unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a miniature marionette that was clearly meant to represent herself. The craftsmanship was exquisite, capturing not only her physical appearance but something of her personality in the puppet's alert expression and purposeful posture. "It's quite remarkable," she said with genuine pleasure. "The detail is extraordinary." "I wanted to capture your essence as an investigator," Mr. Hartwell explained, "someone who sees beyond surface appearances to the truth beneath." Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack examined the puppet with obvious admiration for the craftsmanship. "Will you continue with puppet shows after all this?" Dr. Haydock asked. Mr. Hartwell's expression grew thoughtful. "I believe I'll return to more traditional entertainment. Yesterday's performance was necessary for justice, but I prefer my art to bring joy rather than expose corruption." Miss Marple nodded with understanding. "Art serves many purposes, Mr. Hartwell. Sometimes it entertains, sometimes it educates, and occasionally it serves joy. Your puppets served all three purposes admirably." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "Judge Blackwood asked me to convey his appreciation to all of you for your assistance. He's particularly grateful that the village constabulary and citizens were willing to cooperate with such an unusual investigation." "Will the judge be returning to his judicial duties?" Miss Marple inquired. "Eventually," Slack replied. "But first he'll be testifying in the various trials that will result from this investigation. Morrison and his co-conspirators will face serious charges." The conversation turned to the practical aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure. Property titles would need to be corrected, wrongful convictions overturned, and the entire regional legal system reviewed for additional corruption. "It's sobering to realize how much damage a small group of corrupt officials can cause," Dr. Haydock observed. "The ripple effects will be felt for years." Mr. Hartwell nodded gravely. "That's why Judge Blackwood was so determined to expose the entire network rather than simply saving himself. He understood that partial justice is often no justice at all." As the afternoon progressed and their visitors departed, Miss Marple found herself alone with the miniature marionette, studying its craftsmanship and considering the events of the past few days. The puppet's strings hung loose, waiting for a master's hand to bring it to life, much like the truth about the conspiracy had waited for the right combination of courage, skill, and determination to reveal it. She carefully placed the puppet on her mantelpiece, where it would serve as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most peaceful village, complex dramas of human nature continued to play out. Some of these dramas required careful orchestration to reach a just conclusion, while others needed only patient observation and timely intervention. The mystery of the puppet master's strings had been resolved, but Miss Marple knew that her own strings, the threads of curiosity, observation and moral conviction that guided her investigations, would continue to draw her into new mysteries as they arose in St. Mary Mead. Outside her window the village had returned to its usual peaceful rhythm, but the events of recent days had added new depth to her understanding of the human capacity for both corruption and redemption. Like the best marionettes, people were complex creations capable of beauty and ugliness depending on who pulled their strings and toward what purpose they were directed.
The puppet master's performance was over, but the larger drama of human nature continued, with Miss Marple as both observer and occasional participant in its unfolding acts. Chapter 9: Threads of Truth Unraveled. A week had passed since the dramatic conclusion of the puppet master's conspiracy, and Miss Marple was enjoying a quiet morning in her garden when she received an unexpected visitor. Judge Blackwood himself appeared at her gate, looking considerably more rested and well-groomed than during his dramatic reappearance in Mr. Hartwell's workshop. "Miss Marple," he said with genuine warmth, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to speak with you privately about your role in recent events." She invited him into her sitting room, where the miniature marionette Mr. Hartwell had crafted occupied a place of honor on the mantelpiece. Judge Blackwood noticed it immediately and smiled with obvious appreciation. "Edmund's work is truly remarkable," he observed. "That puppet captures your essence perfectly, alert, thoughtful, and ready for action when circumstances require it." Miss Marple poured tea and settled into her chair with the comfortable efficiency of someone accustomed to hosting unexpected guests with important matters to discuss. "Judge Blackwood," she began, "I must confess that your elaborate deception, while ultimately successful, raised some troubling questions about the lengths to which even honest officials might go to achieve justice." The judge's expression grew serious. "You're concerned about the ethics of our methods. I'm concerned about the precedent," Miss Marple replied carefully. "If respected members of the judiciary can stage their own deaths and manipulate criminal investigations, what prevents less scrupulous individuals from using similar tactics for less noble purposes?" Judge Blackwood considered this thoughtfully. "It's a valid concern, and one that I struggled with throughout the operation. But the corruption we were fighting had penetrated so deeply into official channels that conventional methods would have been insufficient. Nevertheless," Miss Marple continued, "the use of deception even in service of truth creates troubling ambiguities. How does one distinguish between justified subterfuge and criminal fraud?" "Intent," the judge replied promptly, "and ultimate accountability. Everything we did was documented and will be subject to official review. If our methods are deemed inappropriate, we'll face the consequences." Miss Marple nodded, appreciating his willingness to engage with her concerns. "And what of the psychological impact on those who were deceived?" "Mrs. Pemberton and Mr. Whitmore genuinely believed they were complicit in covering up your murder." "That was indeed a heavy burden to place on them," Judge Blackwood admitted, "but their genuine fear and guilt served to convince Morrison and his associates that our deception was complete. Half-hearted performances would have been detected immediately." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Hartwell, who appeared at the garden gate, carrying what looked like a small puppet theatre. With Judge Blackwood's permission, Miss Marple invited the puppet master to join their discussion. "I've brought something I thought you might find interesting," Mr. Hartwell announced, setting up the miniature theatre on Miss Marple's sitting room table. "A final performance, if you will, that explains how all the pieces of our investigation fit together." The puppet theatre was a perfect replica of the larger version from his workshop, complete with tiny marionettes representing all the principal figures in the conspiracy. As Mr. Hartwell began his performance, the intricate nature of the investigation became clear. "The corruption began 3 years ago," he narrated, "manipulating puppet figures representing Morrison and his co-conspirators, when Detective Chief Inspector Morrison was approached by certain wealthy individuals who wanted protection from legal consequences for their actions. The puppet performance illustrated how Morrison had gradually built a network of corrupt officials, using blackmail, bribery, and intimidation to ensure their cooperation. Judge Blackwood's puppet was shown discovering evidence of this corruption through careful analysis of case patterns and sentencing inconsistencies. When Judge Blackwood realized the scope of the conspiracy, Mr. Hartwell continued, he understood that conventional reporting would be insufficient. Too many official channels had been compromised. The puppet show demonstrated how the judge had approached Mr. Hartwell with the proposal to fake his death, using the puppet master's skills in misdirection and theatrical effects to create a convincing disappearance. "The beauty of the plan," Judge Blackwood interjected, "was that it allowed us to continue the investigation from a position of apparent powerlessness while actually having complete freedom to gather evidence." Miss Marple watched the puppet performance with fascination, noting how the miniature figures captured not only the physical appearance of the various participants but something of their personalities and motivations as well. The puppet shows served multiple purposes, Mr. Hartwell explained as his marionettes continued their performance. They tested the reactions of suspected conspirators, preserved evidence in forms that would never be searched, and created opportunities for covert meetings with our Scotland Yard contacts. The final scene of the puppet performance showed the dramatic confrontation in the workshop, with tiny figures representing all the participants in the case's resolution. The attention to detail was extraordinary, down to miniature props representing the evidence that had been hidden in the larger puppets. Remarkable, Miss Marple said as the performance concluded. You've created not just entertainment, but historical documentation. Judge Blackwood nodded approvingly. This puppet theatre will be preserved as evidence in the trial proceedings. It provides a unique perspective on the investigation's methodology. As Mr. Hartwell packed away his miniature theatre, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case's broader implications. Judge Blackwood, what safeguards will be put in place to prevent similar corruption from taking root again? An excellent question, the judge replied. Scotland Yard is implementing new oversight procedures for regional investigations, and there will be regular audits of case outcomes to identify suspicious patterns. Mr. Hartwell looked up from his packing. I've also been asked to consult on evidence preservation techniques. It seems that my methods of concealing documents in unexpected places have attracted official interest. Miss Marple smiled at this development. From puppet master to forensic consultant, quite a career progression. The skills are more transferable than one might expect, Mr. Hartwell observed. Both require attention to detail, understanding of human psychology, and the ability to create convincing illusions when necessary. Judge Blackwood grew more serious. There's another matter I wanted to discuss with you, Miss Marple. The conspiracy we uncovered was larger than just regional corruption. There are indications that similar networks may exist in other parts of the country. This revelation caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Are you suggesting that Morrison's group was part of a larger organization? We're not certain yet, the judge admitted, but some of the evidence we recovered suggests connections to corruption cases in other jurisdictions. Scotland Yard is conducting a broader investigation. Mr. Hartwell had finished packing his theatre and now sat forward with interest. Judge, are you asking Miss Marple to assist with these other investigations? Not officially, Judge Blackwood replied carefully. But Miss Marple's insights into human nature and her ability to detect deception could prove invaluable if similar situations arise elsewhere. Miss Marple considered this possibility thoughtfully. I appreciate your confidence, Judge Blackwood, but I'm simply a village resident who pays attention to her surroundings. Surely Scotland Yard has more qualified investigators. They have investigators with more formal training, the judge agreed, but few with your intuitive understanding of how ordinary people behave when they're hiding something. That's a rare and valuable skill. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Mrs. Bantry, looking somewhat flustered and carrying what appeared to be an official letter. Jane dear, Mrs. Bantry announced, you have a letter from Scotland Yard. Hand-delivered by a very serious young man in a motor car. Miss Marple accepted the letter with curiosity, noting the official seal and formal presentation. As she read its contents, her eyebrows rose with surprise. It's an invitation, she announced to her assembled guests. Scotland Yard is requesting my assistance as a consultant on cases involving rural communities and complex deceptions. Judge Blackwood smiled with satisfaction. I may have provided a recommendation. Mr. Hartwell clapped his hands together with delight. Miss Marple, consultant detective. It has a wonderful ring to it. Mrs. Bantry was practically vibrating with excitement. Jane, you simply must accept. Think of the adventures, the mysteries you could solve. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful. It's a flattering offer, but I wonder if my methods would translate well to more formal investigations. Your methods, Judge Blackwood said firmly, are exactly what formal investigations often lack. The ability to see beyond procedures and regulations to the human motivations underneath. As the afternoon wore on, and her visitors eventually departed, Miss Marple found herself alone with the Scotland Yard letter and her thoughts. The puppet master's case had revealed not only local corruption, but had also demonstrated her own capacity to contribute meaningfully to complex criminal investigations. She looked at the miniature marionette on her mantelpiece, its strings hanging loose but ready to be animated by skilled hands. Like those strings, her own investigative abilities seemed to be awaiting the right opportunity to be put into motion again. The letter from Scotland Yard represented such an opportunity, a chance to apply her understanding of human nature to mysteries beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead, but it also represented a significant change from her comfortable village routine. As evening approached and she prepared her simple dinner, Miss Marple found herself weighing the attractions of adventure against the comforts of familiarity. The puppet master's strings had revealed truths that needed exposure, but they had also entangled all involved in complexities that would take months to fully resolve. Would she be willing to accept similar entanglements in service of justice? The question would require careful consideration, but as she glanced again at the official letter, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a familiar stirring of curiosity about what mysteries might be waiting for her attention beyond the peaceful boundaries of her village. The puppet master's performance had ended, but it seemed that Miss Marple's own role in the larger drama of criminal investigation might just be beginning. Chapter 10: The Final Curtain Call. 1 month after the dramatic resolution of the puppet master's conspiracy, Miss Marple stood in her garden watching Mr. Hartwell perform for a group of delighted village children. The puppet show was a traditional fairy tale this time, no hidden meanings, no disguised accusations, simply the innocent entertainment that had originally drawn him to the craft. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and the laughter of the children provided a pleasant counterpoint to the more serious reflections that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. The official letter from Scotland Yard remained on her writing desk, still awaiting her response to their invitation to serve as a consulting detective. Dr. Haydock approached through the garden gate, his medical bag replaced today by a wrapped package that appeared to contain books. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted her cheerfully. "I see Edmund's returned to more conventional entertainment." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, watching as a puppet princess escaped from a cardboard castle, "though I suspect his recent experiences have given him a deeper appreciation for the power of performance to influence reality." "Speaking of recent experiences, Dr. Haydock said, producing the wrapped package, "I've brought you something I thought you might find interesting, the official report on the corruption investigation." Miss Marple accepted the package with curiosity. The report was substantial, bound in official blue covers and marked with various government seals. As she flipped through its pages, the scope of the conspiracy's impact became even clearer than it had been during the dramatic revelations in Mr. Hartwell's workshop. 15 wrongful convictions overturned, she read aloud, 43 cases under review for evidence tampering, estimated financial losses of over £200,000 in fraudulent property transfers. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. The ripple effects are still being felt throughout the regional legal system. Judge Blackwood's courage in exposing this corruption has prevented immeasurable additional harm.
Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who approached with obvious satisfaction. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock," he greeted them. "I thought you'd like to know that Morrison and his principal co-conspirators received their sentences this morning." "Substantial ones, I hope?" Miss Marple inquired. "Morrison received 15 years for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder," Slack confirmed. "His associates received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years depending on their level of involvement." As they spoke, the puppet show concluded to enthusiastic applause from the children. Mr. Hartwell took his bow with obvious pleasure, clearly relieved to be creating joy rather than exposing corruption through his art. "Hartwell," Miss Marple called as he approached their small group, "that was a delightful performance. Much more relaxing than your previous work, I imagine." The puppet master smiled, but his expression carried a note of seriousness. "Miss Marple, I actually wanted to speak with you about something. I've received an interesting proposition from Scotland Yard." This statement caught everyone's attention immediately. "They've asked you to consult on other cases?" Dr. Haydock asked. "In a manner of speaking, Mr. Hartwell replied. They want me to develop training materials on evidence concealment and preservation techniques. It seems that my methods of hiding documents in puppets have applications for protecting witnesses and preserving evidence in dangerous situations. Inspector Slack looked intrigued. Practical applications for puppet making in criminal investigations. More than you might expect, Mr. Hartwell confirmed. The skills required for creating convincing illusions, for understanding human psychology, for manipulating perceptions, they're all relevant to investigative work. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the Scotland Yard letter, still awaiting her response. It seems that our little village has produced quite a collection of unlikely consultants for criminal investigation. About that, Inspector Slack said, producing an official-looking envelope from his coat pocket. I've been asked to deliver this to you personally. The envelope bore the same Scotland Yard seals as the previous letter, but this one was marked urgent and addressed in a different hand. As Miss Marple opened it, she found not another invitation but a specific request for assistance with an ongoing case. They want me to consult on a case involving disappearances in rural communities, she announced after reading the letter. It seems that several elderly residents of small villages have vanished under suspicious circumstances, and conventional investigative methods have proved insufficient. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with interest. The sort of case where understanding village dynamics and human nature would be essential. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. They're particularly interested in my ability to identify inconsistencies in witness statements and to detect when community members are concealing information. Mr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. It sounds like the perfect application of your skills, Miss Marple. Will you accept? Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her decision crystallizing as she considered the request. I believe I will. After all, if recent events have taught us anything, it's that the skills we develop in quiet village life often prove surprisingly applicable to larger mysteries. Inspector Slack smiled with obvious satisfaction. Excellent. I'll be interested to hear about your experiences with Scotland Yard's investigative methods. As the afternoon progressed and her visitors departed, Miss Marple found herself preparing for what would undoubtedly be a significant change in her routine. The invitation to consult with Scotland Yard represented not just professional recognition but an opportunity to apply her observational skills to mysteries that extended far beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead. She looked once more at the miniature marionette on her mantelpiece, its strings hanging ready for animation. Like those strings, her own investigative instincts had been awakened by the puppet master's case and were now ready to be directed toward new challenges. The puppet master's performance had concluded with justice served and truth revealed, but it had also demonstrated that even the most peaceful communities could harbor complex secrets that required careful unraveling. If similar mysteries existed elsewhere, then perhaps her village-honed skills could indeed serve a larger purpose. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple began composing her acceptance letter to Scotland Yard. The puppet master's strings had revealed one set of truths, but there were undoubtedly other mysteries waiting to be solved, other strings that needed pulling to bring hidden secrets into the light. The curtain was falling on one performance, but Miss Marple sensed that it was also rising on another, one in which she would play a more active role in ensuring that justice, like a skillfully manipulated marionette, would dance to the tune of truth rather than deception. The puppet master had taught her that sometimes the most effective way to reveal reality was through the careful orchestration of illusion and performance. Perhaps it was time for Miss Marple to become a puppet master of sorts herself, pulling the strings of investigation to make truth dance before audiences who preferred to remain in darkness. The mystery of the puppet master's strings was solved, but the larger mystery of human nature, with all its capacity for both corruption and redemption, would continue to unfold, performance after performance, case after case, wherever skilled hands were willing to pull the strings that would reveal the truth.